Every time Alexander appears in the series, something is collapsing. A city, a civilization, a timeline, a human mind. And it never arrives like a normal summon. It rises like a wall, a cathedral made of metal, a fortress built to stop something impossible. And suddenly, Alexander stops feeling like a summon and starts feeling like a god made from machinery, a manufactured divinity, a holy machine, a fortress engineered to hold back the impossible. Alexander has always felt more like architecture. Even in its earliest appearances, the pattern was already there. In Final Fantasy VI, Alexander appears as a holy fortress tied directly to holy itself, and over time, Final Fantasy keeps pushing that imagery further. Final Fantasy VII turns Alexander into something closer to mechanical judgment, a gigantic monument wrapped in sacred light. But in Final Fantasy IX, the symbolism finally becomes impossible to ignore. As Bahamut descends upon the city, Alexander rises from the castle itself, like the last hope in trying to preserve its own existence. Like Alexandria itself transforming into a god made from stone, walls, and machinery. And Alexandria was not just a random fantasy name. Historically, there were multiple cities named Alexandria, founded during the campaigns of Alexander the Great as symbols of expansion, order, permanence, and civilization itself. Massive cultural strongholds built to impose structure onto hostile territory. And that idea exists at the center of almost every version of Alexander in Final Fantasy. It appears when something is about to collapse, may it be a kingdom, civilization, or even reality itself. And every single time Alexander rises like humanity's final wall against the end. But the deeper question is, why does Alexander keep appearing as a fortress in the first place? Because none of this imagery was created by accident. The walls, and all of its holy architecture, the gigantic metallic structures built to contain catastrophe, that symbolism already existed centuries ago. Hidden behind the design is an ancient apocalyptic legend tied to Alexander the Great. A king who travelled to the edge of the world and built colossal iron gates to contain the forces that would one day destroy civilization itself. In those legends, the enemy was known as Gog and Magog, the embodiments of apocalypse and chaos, the end of order, the collapse of civilization. And according to the myth, Alexander did not destroy them. It contained them, using gigantic barriers forged from iron and bronze between the mountains at the edge of the world. Which suddenly makes Alexander's design across Final Fantasy feel a lot less random. And this is where the symbolism becomes genuinely disturbing. Because in the original legends, the gates are not permanent. Eventually, the walls fail. Eventually, the apocalypse escapes. Which means Alexander was never really a symbol of victory. It was a symbol of delay. More time. One final barrier before the end. The universe of Final Fantasy eventually transformed that wall into something far stranger. A machine. And nowhere is that transformation more visible than in Final Fantasy VIII. Even the way Alexander is obtained feels strangely appropriate. The summon is drawn from Medea, a figure who, for much of the game, embodies authority, control, and institutional power. A ruler, a public face of fear, and a vessel for a force greater than herself. Which makes Alexander's presence surprisingly fitting. Because unlike summons associated with nature or destruction, Alexander has always been tied to order, to systems, structure, to organized power. The contrast becomes even more interesting when we look at what sits nearby in the game itself. Alexander can even be drawn later in the game from Catoblepas, a creature traditionally associated with death, decay, and destruction, a symbol of fatality, of endings that cannot be avoided. And standing opposite that idea is Alexander, protection, the wall raised against what cannot be stopped. But the most fascinating detail appears during the summon animation itself. Alexander rises between mountains, a strangely familiar image. Because centuries before Final Fantasy existed, the legends surrounding Alexander the Great described colossal gates erected between mountains at the edge of the world. A barrier built to contain Gog and Magog, a wall raised against the apocalypse. Whether intentional or not, the visual parallel is difficult to ignore. Only now it has become something new. Stone has become steel, architecture has become machinery, and divinity has become engineered. Which reflects a much broader shift happening throughout Japanese science fiction during the 1990s. Again and again, the same question kept appearing. What happens when humanity stops building machines and starts building gods? A god made from the machine. The question was no longer whether humanity could build bigger weapons. The question was whether humanity could manufacture salvation itself. Across anime, games, and science fiction, religious imagery increasingly fused with machinery. Cathedrals became megastructures, angels became weapons, faith became technology. And Alexander fit perfectly into that evolution. It was always associated with walls, fortresses, order, and protection. The leap from sacred architecture to sacred machinery was surprisingly small. In many ways, it was inevitable, which is what makes Alexander feel so different from almost every other summon in the franchise. Bahamut, Ifrit, Shiva, and all the others. They feel alive. Ancient forces older than humanity itself, something sacred. But Alexander feels constructed, as though an entire civilization looked at the approaching apocalypse and decided to build a god. But what happens when even that isn't enough? Because as Alexander evolved throughout series, its purpose never really changed. In Final Fantasy XIII, Alexander is no longer protecting kingdoms or civilization. It is protecting a person. Hope Estime is one of the most emotionally fragile characters in the game. Consumed by grief, fear, a sense of powerlessness that turns good men cruel. And yet the Eidolon that answers him is not as a force of vengeance, but Alexander, as though the walls had moved inward, as though the final thing Alexander was protecting was the human mind itself. But Final Fantasy XIV pushes the idea even further. More than any other incarnation, this version understands what Alexander truly is. A system designed to prevent catastrophe. As told before, legends spoke of walls raised against the apocalypse. Final Fantasy XIV asks a far more terrifying question. What if the wall could see the future? What follows is perhaps the most extreme evolution of the idea in the entire franchise. Alexander becomes a colossal machine capable of perceiving countless possibilities across time itself, attempting to protect reality from its own collapse. And yet, it reaches the same conclusion as the ancient legends. Absolute protection is impossible. The perfect future cannot be sustained. the wall cannot hold forever. And suddenly, the meaning behind Alexander becomes clear. The city could fall. The civilization could collapse. The timeline could unravel. The human mind could break. And every version of Alexander was built for the same purpose: to buy a little more time. So why does Alexander feel different? Because Alexander was never really a summon. It was humanity's answer to the apocalypse, a god made from stone, steel, and machinery, a final wall built against the impossible. And like every wall ever built, it was never meant to last forever. One more wall, one more chance, one more day for hope to survive.